HOA put 96 homes on my land. I let them finish construction, then pulled the deed out in court. First, subscribe my channel HOA Stories and show some support. Baby the land they forgot. I owned when you inherit land. You don't always see its true value right away. To me, my family's 40-acre plot was just a quiet stretch of earth at the edge of town. It was more memories than money. I remembered running through the tall grass as a kid, climbing the old oak tree in the middle of the field, and listening to my grandfather tell stories about how he had bought it for next to nothing, when the town was just a speck on the map. But over the years, the town grew. Suburbs spilled outward like waves. Developers cutting down forests, paving over fields, and erecting homes so close together you could hear your neighbor sneeze through the wall. My land sat just beyond their reach until the HOA came knocking, except they didn't knock. One day, I drove out to check on the property. What I saw nearly knocked the breath out of me. The field wasn't empty anymore. It was crawling with heavy machinery, half-built houses, survey stakes, concrete foundations, and a giant sign that read, "Future site of Willow Creek Estates, 96 luxury homes." I just stood there, mouth open, as bulldozers rumbled across my family's land, like they owned the place. Workers hammered away, completely oblivious to the fact that they were trespassing. At first, I thought I must be mistaken. Maybe I had driven to the wrong field. Maybe I'd forgotten that Grandpa sold it years ago. But no, I had the deed tucked neatly in a safety deposit box. That land was still mine. I stormed over to the nearest site manager, a man in a hard hat barking orders. "Hey!" I shouted over the roar of machinery. "What's going on here? This is my land." He barely looked at me. "Sorry, sir, this is private property. You'll have to step back beyond the fence." I felt my blood pressure spike. "Private property? Yeah, it's my property. Where's your boss? Who gave you permission to build here?" The man rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed. "The Willow Creek HOA purchased this land fair and square. Now, please don't interfere with construction." HOA. That word sent a chill down my spine. I'd heard plenty of horror stories about them. Petty fines, bullying homeowners, controlling every blade of grass in their neighborhoods. But this, building nearly 100 homes on someone else's land without even checking ownership, that was a new level of arrogance. I left the site fuming, my mind racing. I could have called the sheriff right then and there. I could have marched into court the next day with the deed and shut the whole project down. But as I drove home, a wicked thought began to form. What if I didn't stop them? What if I let them keep building, pouring millions into homes, roads, landscaping, even sewer lines, all on land that still legally belonged to me? What would happen when I finally revealed the truth? The more I thought about it, the more I smiled. These people were trying to erase me, to steal what had been in my family for generations. They assumed I was too ignorant, too powerless to notice. Well, I wasn't ignorant, and I wasn't powerless. So, I made a decision. I would let them build. I would watch them spend every last dime constructing their shiny new subdivision. And when the time was right, I would walk into court with the deed in my hand and watch their entire empire collapse. For months, I played the long game. I visited the site often, sometimes pretending to be a curious bystander, other times blending in with the workers. Nobody ever questioned me. I watched as the foundations went up, then the walls, then the roofs. I saw roads paved, streetlights installed, and for sale signs planted in the ground. Families began touring the half-finished homes, dreaming about their lives in Willow Creek Estates. And through it all, the HOA board strutted around like kings. They held community meetings under tents on my property, handing out glossy brochures that promised exclusive amenities, family-friendly living, and a strong neighborhood spirit. The arrogance was staggering. One afternoon, I overheard two board members talking near the sales office trailer. "We got a steal on this land," one of them bragged. "Can you believe we paid almost nothing for it?" The previous owner must have been desperate. "Best investment we ever made." I nearly laughed out loud. Desperate? Please, they hadn't bought a thing. Whatever paperwork they had was either fraudulent or sloppily filed, and when the time came, the truth would crush them. By the end of that year, all 96 homes were standing tall. A brand new neighborhood sparkled on what used to be my family's quiet field. Kids rode bikes down the sidewalks. Lawns were perfectly trimmed. Neighbors waved to each other over backyard fences. And all the while, I held the deed. I bided my time carefully. If I acted too soon, they might weasel their way out with permits or quick cash settlements. But if I waited until the last house was sold, until every penny of profit was sunk into the development, that's when the trap would spring. Finally, the day came. The HOA held a ribbon-cutting ceremony to celebrate the grand opening of Willow Creek Estates. Local officials attended. A crowd gathered. Cameras flashed as the board president cut the ribbon and declared the neighborhood a shining example of community progress. I stood in the back, smiling to myself. They had no idea. The very next week, I filed my lawsuit, and when we walked into court, I carried with me the one thing that would bring their kingdom crashing down: the original deed, signed decades ago by my grandfather, with my name on it as the legal heir, the deed that silenced the room. When you walk into a courtroom, holding a document that can decide the fate of nearly 100 homes, there's a strange kind of weight in your hands. The deed wasn't just paper. It was power. The proof that every brick, every nail, every roof shingle in Willow Creek Estates sat on land that was still legally mine. Filing the lawsuit had been the easy part. My lawyer and I drafted a simple complaint: trespass, unlawful construction, fraudulent acquisition of property. It was straightforward. The HOA had no legal ownership of my 40 acres. They had built 96 houses, paved roads, and installed infrastructure without a single ounce of authority. Still, I knew what was coming. HOAs don't admit defeat easily. They had money, lawyers, political influence. They thought they could bury me in paperwork, drag things out for years, and make me too tired or too broke to fight. But I wasn't worried. They had built their empire on sand, and I had the storm. The first hearing. The courtroom was packed. Dozens of homeowners sat in the gallery, whispering nervously. They had just bought their dream homes, and now they were learning those homes stood on stolen land. HOA board members sat at their table, stiff in suits, their faces pale but defiant. The judge entered, and silence fell. My lawyer, a calm but sharp man named Carter, stood first. He presented the deed. "Your Honor, this is the original and uncontested proof of ownership for the land in question. My client inherited it directly from his grandfather. The chain of title is clean, uninterrupted, and legally binding. At no point did my client sell or transfer this land to the defendants or their association." He handed the document to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. The room held its breath as the judge examined it, flipping through the notarized pages. The HOA's attorney, a slick man in a grey suit named Henderson, jumped up. "Objection, Your Honor. This so-called deed is outdated. My clients purchased this land in good faith from a development company 5 years ago. The records show." The judge held up a hand. "Mr. Henderson, do you have a valid deed that shows your clients own this property?" Henderson shuffled papers, clearly unprepared for the question. "We have agreements, surveys, permits issued by the county." "Not what I asked." The judge interrupted. His tone was cool, but his eyes were sharp. "Do you have a deed that proves ownership?" Silence. Henderson cleared his throat. "No, Your Honor, but surely." The judge set my deed down gently. "Then the court recognizes the plaintiff as the rightful owner of the land, known as Willow Creek Estates. Mr. Henderson, your clients may have acted under the assumption they owned the property, but assumptions do not override deeds. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Homeowners looked horrified, whispering frantically. The HOA board members stared straight ahead, their confidence crumbling. I felt a surge of satisfaction, but I kept my face calm. This wasn't about gloating yet. This was about watching the walls close in, the HOA's desperation. Over the next weeks, the HOA scrambled. They filed counterclaims, accusing me of lying in wait, of sabotaging their project, even of trying to extort money from innocent homeowners. Their argument was absurd. He knew we were building. Henderson thundered in one hearing. He could have stopped us at any time. Instead, he let us spend millions, just so he could swoop in later and profit off our hard work. That's entrapment. The judge was unmoved. Mr. Henderson, your clients are not victims of entrapment. They are victims of their own negligence. If you build on land you don't own, the law does not protect you. The deed is clear. The land belongs to the plaintiff. Each time the judge said those words, I felt the ground shift further under the HOA's feet. They had built a neighborhood on lies, and now those lies were crumbling like drywall in a storm. Homeowners in panic, of course. The real victims weren't just the HOA board. They were the families who had bought homes in Willow Creek Estates. Every day I got angry phone calls, letters, even people showing up at my office. You can't take our homes. One woman sobbed. We put our life savings into this place. My kids just started school here. Another man said, his voice shaking with rage. You're going to ruin us. I understood their pain. I truly did. But their anger was misplaced. I hadn't sold them false promises. I hadn't built on land that didn't belong to me. The HOA had, and now everyone was paying the price. Still, I wasn't cruel. I didn't want to evict 96 families into the street overnight. What I wanted was justice and accountability, and I wanted the HOA to bleed. The turning point in court, the next major hearing, Henderson tried one last desperate move. He brought in glossy binders full of permits, zoning approvals, and environmental surveys. Your Honor, look at the investments my clients have made, he pleaded. This development has boosted the local economy, created jobs, and provided housing for nearly 100 families. Surely, equity demands that the plaintiff be compensated fairly. Not allowed to take everything, the judge leaned forward. Mr. Henderson, equity does not erase ownership. Your clients built on land they did not own. That is not the court's fault, nor the plaintiff's. That is their own reckless error. Then he turned to me. Mr. Now your last name. What remedy are you seeking? The entire courtroom went silent. I stood. My heart pounded, but my voice was steady. Your Honor, I seek recognition as the legal owner of Willow Creek Estates. I request damages for unlawful trespass and construction, and I ask that all future decisions regarding this land, including who may live on it and under what terms, be made by me as the rightful owner. Gasps filled the room. The HOA board members looked like they'd swallowed nails. Homeowners stared at me with wide eyes, realizing that the ground beneath their dream homes now legally belonged to a man they barely knew. The judge nodded slowly. Very well, the court will deliberate, waiting for the ruling. Those weeks of waiting were some of the longest of my life. My phone never stopped ringing. News outlets picked up the story. Headlines blared, HOA built on wrong land, homeowners at risk. Man sues for control of entire neighborhood. 96, families caught in HOA nightmare. Some people called me a genius. Others called me a monster, but I didn't care what they called me. I only cared about the ruling. Finally the day came. The judge entered the courtroom, his expression unreadable. He read from the bench. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff. Ownership of the land remains with Mr. on your last name. The Willow Creek HOA is hereby ordered to compensate the plaintiff for damages, including but not limited to trespass, unlawful construction, and profits earned from home sales. Further remedies regarding the residence and the subdivision will be addressed in a forthcoming order. The gavel came down. The room erupted. Homeowners cried. HOA board members cursed under their breath. My lawyer shook my hand firmly. I just sat there, calm and quiet, with the deed still in my possession. It was over. At least, the first battle was. The war for what came next. That was only beginning. The fallout and the power shift, when the gavel struck and the judge declared me the rightful owner of Willow Creek Estates. I thought the worst was over. But in truth, that ruling was only the end of the first chapter. The next chapter was chaos. The HOA's collapse. Within 48 hours of the verdict, the Willow Creek HOA Board resigned. Not out of honor, but because they were cornered. Their lawyer, Henderson, tried to appeal, but appeals take time, and time wasn't on their side. The judge's ruling had already transferred control of the land, and by extension, the homes, back to me. The HOA had no authority anymore. Their bank accounts were frozen, their contracts nullified, their bylaws unenforceable. The same board that once strutted around issuing fines for unauthorized lawn ornaments, or trash, cans visible from the street, now couldn't even park in the subdivision without my permission. The homeowners were stunned. They had been paying monthly HOA dues, thinking their money maintained the neighborhood. But now, that money had nowhere to go. Checks bounced. Maintenance crews stopped showing up. The once pristine streets started looking neglected, and every frustrated resident turned their anger toward me. Are you our new HOA? One homeowner demanded when I visited the site a week later. No, I said evenly. I'm the landowner. But what does that mean for us? Do we still own our homes? That was the million-dollar question. Who really owned the homes? The irony of the situation was brutal. These families had bought houses, signed mortgages, and moved in. But the foundations of their homes were on land they didn't own. Normally, when you buy a house, the deed includes both the structure and the land. But in Willow Creek Estates, the land deed the HOA had provided was invalid. That meant every single one of those 96 families technically owned nothing. They were like renters who had paid full price for houses they didn't legally control. My lawyer explained it simply. The land is yours. The structures belong to the people who bought them. But since those structures are on your land without your permission, you can legally charge them rent, negotiate new land sale agreements, or even demand removal. Removal, I asked, half laughing. You mean tear down 96 houses? He shrugged. It's your land. If you want a field again, you can bulldoze it. But most landowners would lease or sell. There's money to be made here. And that's when I realized the HOA hadn't just stolen from me. They had accidentally handed me the biggest bargaining chip of my life. The power play word spread fast. News outlets ran updates daily. Man wins control over entire neighborhood. 96 families at mercy of landowner. After HOA blunder, reporters camped outside the subdivision. Drones buzzed overhead. I couldn't go grocery shopping without someone shoving a microphone in my face. Are you going to evict these families? Will you bulldoze the homes? Are you planning to sell the neighborhood back to the residents? I stayed quiet, giving no clear answers. The less I said, the more the HOA's former victims panicked, and the more leverage I had. Behind the scenes, I began meeting with homeowners one by one. Some came angry, some came desperate, some came begging. They all wanted security. I'll pay you whatever you want, one father said, his hands shaking. Just sell me the land under my house. My wife is pregnant. We can't lose this place. I leaned back in my chair. Maybe I will, but I'm not selling cheap. You see, Land under a subdivision is worth more than land in a field. And thanks to your HOA, I now own the most valuable leverage in this county. It was harsh, but it was true. Some homeowners tried to band together, forming committees, hiring lawyers, even contacting politicians. But the law was the law. The deed was ironclad. And at the end of the day, every homeowner was stuck negotiating with me, the one man they had ignored when the bulldozers first rolled in. Deals and settlements, I had options. Sell the land outright to each homeowner at a premium price. Lease the land under 99-year agreements, creating a steady stream of income. Evict the most troublesome residents and resell the homes myself. Turn the subdivision into a private gated community. My own rules, my own terms. I chose a mix of all four. The wealthier families, who could afford it, bought the land outright. They paid 3 times what an empty lot should have cost. But they paid it gladly, because the alternative was losing everything. Others, who couldn't afford the purchase, signed long-term land leases. They hated the idea of paying rent for land they thought they'd already bought, but they had no choice. And the most stubborn families, the ones who screamed at me, threatened me, or called me a crook, I didn't renew negotiations with them. I filed eviction orders instead. It was brutal. U-Hauls lined the streets some weekends, families packing up their dream homes in defeat. But each time one left, I gained a property I could resell properly. This time, with both the land and the house deeded together. Those sales brought in millions. The community shifts. By the second year, Willow Creek Estates looked different. About a quarter of the original homeowners were gone. The remaining 3/4 either owned or leased their land under my terms. But the biggest change wasn't in the houses. It was in the rules. The HOA had fallen, but in its place, I established my own system. I called it the Landowner's Charter. Unlike the petty, overbearing HOA rules, my charter was simple. No fines for nonsense. No one cared if your grass grew an inch too long, or if you painted your shutters purple. Respect the land. No illegal dumping. No damaging common areas. Pay your dues. Whether lease or purchase, everyone owed what they agreed to. At first, residents hated it. They thought I was just another dictator, replacing the HOA with myself. But slowly, something shifted. People realized I wasn't micromanaging their lives. I didn't care if they parked an RV in their driveway or put up Christmas lights in July. All I wanted was respect for the land and my payments. Over time, many admitted the truth. It was better. Life without the HOA's petty tyranny was freeing. And while they resented how it happened, they couldn't deny that the new system worked. The HOA board's fate is, for the former board members, their lives crumbled. The court ordered them personally liable for damages. They faced lawsuits from nearly every homeowner they had tricked. Their dream development had turned into a nightmare, and they were bankrupt within a year. I'll never forget running into one of them, the former board president, at a gas station. He was unshaven, his suit rumpled, his car dented. "You ruined us," he spat. I just smiled. "No, you ruined yourself when you built on land you didn't own." He walked away without another word. My transformation. At the beginning, this was just about revenge, about teaching an arrogant HOA a lesson for trespassing on my family's land. But as the months turned into years, I realized it had become something more. I wasn't just a landowner anymore. I was a power broker. I had turned one mistake into an empire. The land that once sat empty, ignored, now generated more wealth than I could have imagined. And I had influence, not just over the residents of Willow Creek, but over the entire county. Developers approached me cautiously, asking about future projects. Politicians sought my endorsement, knowing my story was national news. even other HOAs reached out, terrified of making the same mistake. And I never let them forget it. Every time I walked the streets of Willow Creek Estates, my streets, I thought of my grandfather's oak tree in the field, of the bulldozers that tried to erase my family's legacy, and I thought of the deed, the single piece of paper that had turned everything around. The HOA thought they could take my land. Instead, I took their entire neighborhood. And the best part? I wasn't done yet, because if one HOA could be brought to its knees, others could too, and I had just gotten started. When people ask how it felt to stand at the center of a storm I'd helped create, I tell them one thing. It felt like standing on a cliff after a long climb. Wind in my hair, hands scraped, lungs burning, and the world open below me. The victory in the courtroom had been glorious, but it was only the beginning of a far larger arc. How to turn a vindictive, righteous win into something that would stick. That would change the way people thought about property, power, and who gets to decide what community means. You asked for the grand finale, the part where every loose end is pulled tight and the story arcs close with the satisfaction of consequence and a little bit of poetic justice. So here it is, what I did after I owned a whole neighborhood, how I wielded that ownership, how I chose to break and remake things, and finally, the way the whole saga exploded into something viral and permanent. The quiet before the storm, after the judge ruled and the initial chaos subsided, Willow Creek Estates entered a hush that felt unnatural. Mowers didn't run. The clubhouse lights were off. The for sale signs that had been planted so proudly now looked like tombstones. Reporters dispersed, lawsuits multiplied, and mail piled up at the gated entrance until the deputy sheriff sent the HOA's frozen accounts a terse notice. It was in that silence that I planned. I spent long nights poring over title reports, tax assessments, municipal records, and the HOA's contracts and insurance policies. I met with my attorney, an accountant, and, not without irony, a media consultant. The goal was never simply to monetize. Revenge can be sweet, but it's ephemeral. What I wanted was structural change, accountability, so other landowners wouldn't get bulldozed by process, and deterrence so that boards and developers would think twice before assuming the worst. While the town buzzed about what would happen next, I set 3 objectives. Protect the families who deserved protection, those who had acted in good faith, who bought homes believing them legitimate, would not be left penniless and homeless by my vindictiveness. Hold the guilty accountable. The board members and the contractors who enabled them would face legal and financial consequences, commensurate with the scale of the harm they caused. Create a public lesson. I wanted the story to change practices and laws, not just punish a few people, but shift the incentives that made that kind of theft possible in the first place. These objectives were a compass. The methods changed as the stakes rose. The negotiation table and the first big decision, I called the homeowners to the community center, now under my control, and I laid out what I planned to do. I didn't go in gloating. I went in pragmatic. I explained the options, broadly, sell, lease, or evict, and made a proposal that combined compassion with leverage. For those who could prove they had acted in good faith, purchased in good faith, followed the HOA's lead, and had been living there responsibly, I offered 2 paths. A land purchase option at a premium, yes, but with a fair financing program, I negotiated with a local bank. They could buy the land under their homes in annual installments over 20 years with interest rates that reflected my intention to be reasonable, not predatory. A long-term lease, 99 years, renewable, with a cap on annual increases and tenant protections, similar to those you'd find in a long-term ground lease. It gave people stability without the upfront cost. For families with limited means, I created a hardship fund. I made it clear that this fund was not charity. It was a rebalancing of the profits extracted by the HOA's scheme. I redirected some of the court-ordered damages and settlements into the fund, and I set up a non-profit arm to administer it, so the process would be transparent and legally defensible. The board members and contractors were a different story. We pursued them civilly and criminally. Some faced charges for fraud and willful negligence, others for conspiracy and falsification of public records. Their assets were seized where possible. The county revoked certain contractor licenses and tightened permit checks. I made sure these penalties were public, because deterrence works best with a spotlight. Leverage and the art of not burning bridges. Owning the land gave me a terrifyingly powerful lever, but raw power can be corrosive if wielded only for spite. I had a choice: monetize every square inch till nothing felt like the land that had raised me, or use ownership as a tool to transform. So I found middle ground. Some properties I resold with full title, land plus a house, at market prices, after rehabilitating title issues with clear, ironclad documentation. Other lots I held and developed into different projects: a small park, a community garden, and a public playground named after my grandfather. I seeded the park with a bench and planted the same species as the oak that used to stand there. It felt symbolic and human. I also created a homeowners council to replace the old HOA. This wasn't about centralizing power under me. The council had representatives elected by residents, with clearly defined powers and limits. They could set neighborhood aesthetic standards. If residents wanted, organize events and manage shared spaces. But the council had no pretense to absolute control. Major decisions required a supermajority, and crucially, my approval as landowner, only when those decisions impacted legal titles or the land itself. It was a messy compromise, a hybrid governance model that acknowledged the reality that land ownership gives legal sway, but that also recognized community norms and democratic legitimacy. It forced people to participate, to rebuild trust, and to learn democracy in the smallest of laboratories: their porches, their block parties, their dispute resolution meetings. The legal finale, appeals, precedents, and the new doctrine, the HOA's lawyers appealed. They threw everything at appellate courts: claims of estoppel, lashes, supposed municipal complicity, and procedural quibbles that might confuse any judge who didn't care to dig into title history. Appeals were a predictable drag in the wheels of justice. I did two things. First, I fortified my record. We combed through every filing, notarized document, and county ledger, and created an airtight paper trail. Second, I used the high-profile nature of the case to lobby for legal reform. I sat down with county supervisors and legislators. I testified in hearings. I proposed specific changes: stricter oversight on property transfers involving HOAs, mandatory title searches before major development permits are issued, and stronger penalties for boards and developers who willfully proceed without clear title. The result was a ripple. Other counties noticed. A few states quietly updated statutes governing common interest communities. Newspaper editorials ran opinion pieces. The Willow Creek Doctrine, they called it, meant to describe a legal concept. You can't assume title by building on land. You can't create ownership by municipal auto-approval if the chain of title is broken. At worst, it was a symbolic name. At best, it tightened the law enough to prevent a repeat of what happened to me. The HOA's appeal failed in circuit court. There was some small moral victory in watching their legal options evaporate. But the real victory was the doctrinal shift. When people asked about precedent, I started to answer not with a gloating grin, but with policy. That's when the story truly grew teeth. The viral twist stories have their own gravity. People loved the David versus Goliath arc. The internet loved revenge. A couple of documentary producers wanted access. A small regional paper ran a long investigative feature that went national. The narrative that had been a local mess suddenly became instructive content for millions. The twist that made this go viral, though, wasn't just the court drama. It was the way the community responded when given options. A handful of sensational clips. A board member cursing into his phone as he was escorted from a bank. A child planting a sapling in the new park. A clip of me calmly signing lease agreements with a family in tears of relief. Became the keys to virality. People wanted villainy punished, but they also wanted restoration. My restraint in offering fair deals to homeowners softened the story from revenge porn into restorative justice in action. A documentary titled Fields of Deed premiered on a streaming service. It combined courtroom footage, homeowner interviews, and my own narration. It didn't glorify me. Instead, it framed the issue as systemic failure and community resilience. Donations poured into the hardship fund from strangers who simply wanted to help. Classes at law schools began using Willow Creek as a case study in property law, ethics, and the perverse incentives that can arise in communal governance. And with virality came invitations. I was invited to talk shows, to policy panels, and to university panels. At one such event, a housing advocate asked the room, "Who owns the neighborhood?" The question stuck and reframed many conversations about housing, shared spaces, and power. The human costs, and my reckoning, no story with such stakes is pure. There are always casualties. Families forced to move. Careers ruined for former board members, some of whom were more incompetent than evil. Contractors who'd relied on that development for their livelihoods saw their businesses collapse. Vipers of retribution live in the law's interstices. Sometimes, collateral damage cannot be entirely avoided. There were nights I lay awake, wondering whether I had been too hard. In private, I kept a list of the houses I'd helped save, and a list of the people who'd lost everything. The scales didn't balance easily. To my surprise, reconciliation became part of the finale. A few former board members, broken and genuine, reached out not to beg, but to concede wrongdoing. One of them, someone who had once mocked my insistence on a deed, asked to meet. He brought with him a box of papers, emails revealing pressure from an outside developer who had pushed the HOA to act fast, to close the deal, to ignore red flags. The developer had long since vanished into a string of shell companies. But the truth added nuance to the story. Greed was rarely as simple as one bad person. It was a lattice of small compromises and convenient lies. We never became friends, but the conversation led to an unexpected gesture. Some of the former board members agreed to work on a community restitution committee, helping to run the hardship fund, and even contributing personally where they could. It was a small, imperfect act, but it mattered. Legacy, the oak, the park, and the law years. Later, I walked the park on a crisp morning. Children rode bikes. An elderly couple read beneath the new oak sapling. The playground sang with laughter. Neighbors I'd once negotiated with were now members of the council, animatedly planning a summer festival. The community had not simply survived. It had reconstituted itself. Scarred, wiser, and more civic. Legally, the Willow Creek case became a guardrail. Municipalities adjusted permit rules. Lenders required stricter title evidence for developments involving HOAs. The Willow Creek Doctrine became a shorthand for the principle that you cannot claim absence of prior title by simply investing in construction. The law would not reward sloppy or dishonest acquisition. Financially, I did well. I deliberately set terms that avoided rapacious profiteering, but the returns were substantial. I reinvested a portion into the local economy, a small affordable housing project on the town's edge, scholarships for local students, and a fund to support ethical development practices. I'd leveraged a wrong done to me into resources that could do some good. The final act, a choice about power. The strangest part of any revenge story is what happens after the revenge is complete. You can take the empire or you can loosen your grip. I had the legal authority to hold this land indefinitely, to run it as I pleased. But power without limits is a brittle thing. One Thursday afternoon, at a public meeting beneath that same oak, the council presented a vote. Should Willow Creek continue as a hybrid ownership model, landowner with elected council, or should the land be partitioned and sold entirely to homeowners and third parties, extinguishing the unique constraints of our arrangement? The vote was close. Emotions ran high. I listened as neighbors spoke about stability, autonomy, fear of predatory buyers, and the desire to put the whole scandal firmly in the past. Then I did something that surprised everyone, including myself. I stood up and made an offer. I would sell the land under currently occupied homes to the residents who had taken my purchase or lease options at a price calculated not on market mania, but on fairness. Cost-based plus a modest, fixed premium, and I would set up a deed covenant to prevent precisely the kind of fraud that had ruined so many lives. For empty lots or resold homes, I'd auction parcels transparently, with proceeds funneled into a community endowment. It was diplomatic gold. It extinguished my positional power without leaving the town vulnerable to new predatory practices. It tied the neighborhood's future to democratic oversight and legal clarity. The vote passed. Epilogue. A different kind of victory. The final gavel in the saga was not the one from the courtroom. It was the one that finalized those deeds and transferred titles with rigorous clarity, witnessed by county clerks who'd since tightened verification procedures. The town had been through a crucible and emerged, oddly, more honest for it. People still ask me if I regret what I did. I never answer with a neat line. I say this instead. I don't regret standing for what was mine, nor do I take pleasure in others' suffering. I regret that systems allowed such suffering in the first place. I celebrate that I used the leverage fate handed me to fix a crack, however imperfectly. That, for me, is the point. And on nights when the town is quiet and the park is still, I walk down a lane I once watched being paved without permission. The streetlights hum, a dog barks, somewhere a child laughs. There's a bench under the oak with a brass plaque that reads only simply, "For those who plant and for those who remember to water." The story went viral because it was dramatic. It lasted because it needed to. And it ended, at least in the way stories end. Not with a final vengeance, so much as with a rebalancing. Harms acknowledged, restitution attempted, rules rewritten. The deed remained a central part of the tale. But it was the community's choices afterward that made the saga worth telling.